Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz, Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, we're going to discuss the 4-day conflict between India and Pakistan, which began with India's aggression. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has made a victory speech and also declared a 10-day celebration in India. In Pakistan, the army chief has since been promoted to the rank of field marshal. So basically, both sides have won. It won't be too bad if they were to rest easy until, of course, the climate catastrophe strikes, which it will, and claim this entire landmass anyway. But no, they won't rest easy. India's Modi has already stated his policy. India will respond militarily to any quote-unquote terror threat. India will make no distinction between quote-unquote terrorists and their sponsors. India does not need to present evidence of such a linkage. And finally, India will not tolerate any nuclear blackmail. So this means we are ripe for another conflict. Because for anyone in India to think that Pakistan won't respond to the latter's aggression would mean the entire Indian leadership is on psychoactive drugs. At least that's what the rather flustered Indian foreign minister thought. By his own account, India wanted Pakistan's military to stay out while India bombed civilians inside Pakistan. So there is a mismatch of interests and expectations. Once again, the two sides have walked away from a confrontation or near confrontation, drawing different lessons, which essentially means stability will not return, violence will. But as military historian Cathal Nolan says, political and military leaderships are often drawn into wars by the allure of battle, a decisive battle, to win decisively. Yet, as he posits, it is the single hardest thing to do, to translate combat into achievement of an important strategic and political goal that the other side is forced to recognize and accept when the war is over. So more often, war results in something clouded, neither triumph nor defeat. It is an arena of gray outcomes, partial and ambiguous resolution of disputes and causes that led to the choice of force as an instrument of policy in the first place. So let's dive right into our discussion for this episode. What next for India and Pakistan? I have with me Dr. Christopher Clary. Clary is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University at Albany, State University of New York, and a non-resident fellow with the South Asia program of the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. His most recent book, The Difficult Politics of Peace, Rivalry in Modern South Asia, which came out in 2022, is pertinent to our discussion today. With him is Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Niaz is Professor of History at Qaid-e-Azam University and author of several books, his most recent being New World Empires, Cultures of Power and Governance in the Americas. Niaz has also taught the history of Cold War for a long time. So let's get to this discussion. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Chris, let me begin with you. You put out your initial assessment for Stimson Center. Although you mentioned that there's still a lot of data points that obviously as time passes by, then will become clearer and probably assessments will begin to diverge or converge depending on the kind of information that comes out. What exactly do you think India has achieved?
This is a hard question to ask. Clausewitz at the very beginning said that, war should be this continuation of policy, this continuation of politics. But to understand the political outcomes, there is this mix of the material reality, which is disputed, and then the perceptions and the political ramifications of the conflict, which is a little clearer. So, I think at one level, the politics of this have gone badly for India. I do not necessarily think it is in New Delhi's interest that the military exited the crisis in Pakistan more popular than it entered the crisis, for example. That doesn't seem to be the long game that you would anticipate New Delhi wanting to play, though perhaps they have some multidimensional chess game that they're looking at. This dispute in the international arena has also elevated Pakistan up, right? Many commentators have said that this dispute helped rehyphenate a relationship that India has tried for 20 years to dehyphenate. Because whenever there's a dispute between nuclear powers, people are worried about either nuclear power choosing to escalate, right? So that necessarily puts both countries on the same footing, even as conflict might be symmetric or asymmetric. In fact, as you may recall, in the aftermath of the Mumbai terror attacks in 2008, the Manmohan Singh government decided not to pursue military escalation, in part, we know from memoirs after the fact, based on a calculation that it would complicate India's ability to put diplomatic pressure on Pakistan, which appears to, in part, be the case coming out of this crisis. Over the medium term or longer term, the material realities matter more. And here I think it's too early to tell, right? We know from satellite imagery that there was indeed damage to Pakistani air bases. We know that there was indeed a drone attack. We don't know how successful that drone attack was in terms of the material consequences. India has made claims in that regard. And the more costly the attack was in terms of lives lost or war material on the Pakistani side, then the Pakistan military does know that. It does know that ground reality. And it may factor in those costs as it thinks about choices it has in the coming months and years. And the Pakistani economy, while doing better than it was perhaps a year ago, is still not in great shape. And so these costs will be felt even while the nation, the Pakistanis, have largely rallied around the military, rallied around the leadership in the face of what you called, Indians obviously would dispute this, but that most Pakistanis view as Indian aggression.
Right. So, as far as Pakistan is concerned in terms of material costs, if you recall, the DG ISPR mentioned the damage and the attack on air bases. So Pakistan wasn't particularly hiding anything. The Pakistani Prime Minister has also mentioned this. And there's a conversation going on in terms of what the capability gap was and, how to plug that. But I want to just, the book that I referenced, your latest book, where you look into domestic politicking, I want you to quickly, before I go to Ilhan, give us a sense of, the essentially right-wing Hindutva politics that has taken hold of India, and which in many ways is kind of intrinsically linked not just with internal communalism, but also, as far as the Indian Muslims are concerned, the linkage with Pakistan. How much do you think that is responsible for the kind of, I would say, cul-de-sac that Mr. Modi has walked into or made India walk into?
As an outsider, one can sort of paint two stories. And this one story, which you sort of indicate here, is common in Pakistan, though also common in certain quarters in New Delhi, which is that the Hindu nationalist ideological project is ultimately incompatible with tranquil and peaceful relations with Pakistan. That the effort to consolidate the Hindu vote bank requires a certain level of conflict with the Muslim majority countries on India's periphery. And in the last year, that's not just been Pakistan, but also conflictual relations with Bangladesh as well. Alternatively, I think the story in New Delhi that they would tell you, and this is a true rendering of the facts in some way, is that Narendra Modi came into office, tried rapprochement with Pakistan, and those efforts in 2015 and 2016 did not yield very much. And even after an attack on an airbase in 2016, an effort to have a joint investigation in the minds of, I think, most Indians and most Americans, to be frank, that joint investigation was a dead end. And so, I think in New Delhi, they say they tried something, it didn't work, and now they are exercising some combination of hawkishness and strategic patience. But there is this ideological issue as well. And so I'll leave it to the audience to decide what sort of mix of those narratives they find most persuasive.
Fair enough. Narratives are on both sides. Of course, we in Pakistan, also including Kashmiris like myself, believe that India has to do something about this issue. India has, the Kashmiris have a lot of resistance groups. The Indian state has been killing them regularly. They've been attacking the Indian state regularly. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And I agree with you. Just you mentioned the 2008 incident where Shiv Shankar Menon has also said that, while he was the foreign secretary, he actually wanted a military option against India. But, in hindsight, he believes that the policy of not exercising the military option actually redounded to India's advantage. Ilhan, give me your sense of this situation forward. I particularly mentioned that you have also been teaching the history of Cold War, where there was another nuclear dyad. If we discount Britain and France as being the peer competitors of then Soviet Union, we're talking about the US and the Soviet Union. And after certain crises, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis, it became particularly clear that the center must hold, even if the periphery gets stabilized. So you're not going to lob missiles at each other because that's not going to work. So the center held, it was quiet, the periphery got destabilized, we got this term instability-stability paradox. So my question to you is that a framework, theoretical and policy framework that is applicable to this nuclear dyad, or are we looking at a completely different situation?
Thank you, Ejaz. Ejaz, since this particular crisis took place, I've been combing through my old notes and my study of the Cold War to try and find some precedents in which we can anchor our discussion of what just happened between India and Pakistan. And as yet, I'm not really able to put those actions that took place over 4 days or 88 hours in May or 96 hours, or however you want to count them, into a realm of historical precedence. Part of the reason why this could be the case has been argued by my colleague, Dr. Farhan Siddiqui, in his essay for South Asian Voices, in which he talks about the resolve paradox as he sees it between India and Pakistan. That paradox being that in India and Pakistan, increasingly decision-making about the use of force, particularly from India against Pakistan and then in retaliation from Pakistan towards India, is dictated not by any rational military objective or any rational foreign policy objective, but by a desire to secure a publicity win in the domestic realm. So both sides will escalate to the point where they can claim victory and then de-escalate. So what this effectively means is that India and Pakistan have not just left the American-Soviet deterrence building, they've moved to a new zip code. They are rewriting the rules of engagement between nuclear-armed states. And let's be very frank over here, nuclear-armed states, including the Soviets and the Americans, do all sorts of awful things to each other, from sabotage and espionage to supporting terrorism to fighting proxy wars to economic warfare against each other. So it's not as if the Cold War, even in terms of the US-Soviet relationship, was one of great restraint in terms of the US-Soviet dyad. But there was a basic understanding, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that you really can't afford a direct conflict between the two. So their militaries and their defense forces should avoid a direct clash. And this is something which does not really seem to have been internalized in the India-Pakistan relationship. In fact, what is happening is that the Indians, and in retaliation, both the Pakistanis, are trying to create some sort of a space for a very serious level of conventional conflict between two nuclear armed states. And this is something which, again, one finds very little by way of precedent for. So we can talk about, let's say, the Sino-Soviet border clashes of 1969. But that was a very limited affair. China at that time did not really have much of a nuclear arsenal compared to what the Soviets had. If we look at the Kargil War of 1999, again, India and Pakistan had, in a sense, just entered the stage as a nuclear dyad, and neither side had that many nuclear weapons. So there was really no great threat, if you will, to global civilization. But at present, as let's say the Bulletin of the atomic scientists has argued, an India-Pakistan nuclear exchange would be a catastrophe, not just for our nuclear dyad here in South Asia, but for the entire planet. It would cause a massive global famine that could kill up to 2 billion people. It could effectively destabilize the entire socio and political order of every major country in the world as they struggle to grapple with the resulting food shortages and the health crisis. So this is something which the thinkers in New Delhi do not seem to have factored into their brinksmanship with Pakistan. And this is something which is truly dangerous and strange.
Yeah, I get the point you're making, but if I were to interject, and I actually want to take this to Chris, for instance, Walter Ladwig, in his Rusi article, which frankly, as I've written, was not particularly, something that impressed me. I mean, he's a great scholar otherwise. He talks about the fact that, India is actually really in control of escalation. And that, you can use missiles and you can ratchet it up and you can dial it back. And, this is what he has written. So, Chris, your article, well, it's a longish first impressions of put out by Stimson, where you talk about multiple red lines being crossed. Would you agree with the Arzan Tarapur or Ladwig that India was actually in control of escalation and that it would have remained contained? And also, if we link it up with Farhan's idea of resolve paradox, that India and Pakistan can actually, between the two of them, work out some kind of ceasefire or some kind of stoppage of hostilities, or do we go to Moeed Yusuf's framework of brokered bargaining, where you require the United States to actually come in and other states to actually come in and try and pull them apart?
Yeah, I guess let me put it this way, right? There's a phrase used in advertising for U.S. financial companies that, past performance is no guarantee of future results. I have a nice little induction stovetop here in Europe where I am at the moment, and it's very calibrated. I can put in exactly the number I want, but it doesn't mean that I don't every month or so cause the water to boil over in my very calibrated stovetop onto the surface and mess up my meal plan. So I do think going in to the night of the 10th, India did decide how much escalation it wanted to bite off. On the 7th, that calibration was imperfect because India likely did not anticipate that there would be counter air losses. And so if there were to be another crisis, India couldn't try to turn the volume to that low level because that low level apparently was associated with some risk that India in the future needs to go after air defenses, needs to broaden the campaign, right? So you can calibrate and grab for a rung of the ladder and then decide it was actually more perilous than you might have anticipated. So that is what occurred, I think, on the 7th. And then on the night of the 10th, I do think both countries made conscious decisions about the level of risk they were willing to take. And then on the night of the 10th, it started to move in a direction that I think it would have been difficult to control for much longer. So only the Pakistan Air Force, the Pakistan military knows what the consequences of India's attempts to degrade Pakistan's air command and control system were. Was it harder for the Pakistan Air Force to know what was going on? And if it was, that might have aided Indian offensive air attacks, but it would have made it more difficult for Pakistan to calibrate the response. And if it is difficult to calibrate, then typically one turns the knob a little bit higher to ensure that a safe result occurs. Additionally, on the night of the 9th and the 10th, my read of admittedly fragmentary data is that the Indian air and missile defense system worked fairly well. Well, if that were to continue to occur, then I think that would create incentives for Pakistan to use faster moving or more difficult to intercept assets like cruise missiles or longer range ballistic missiles with conventional warheads. And that would mean that Pakistan could not calibrate by just using the shortest range ballistic missiles in its arsenal, along with some relatively inexpensive drones, right? So the ability to grab for certain rungs in this 4-day conflict was not without some difficulty. And I think it gives lessons to both militaries that they will have to pursue somewhat different strategies, and in maybe some cases, somewhat less calibrated strategies if they were to go into a future crisis.
That's a very good point. Actually, I want to ask you this because there's something that you mentioned in your report also. Pakistan did not use a number of weapon systems, projectiles in its arsenal, because some of them are declared dual use. For instance, the cruise missiles that we have, Rad and Babur 1 and Babur 2, they're declared dual use. Our understanding, frankly, up until now was that Brahmos is also dual use. And I'd like to get your take on that, because they got their DRDO guy to come on TV and say that, no, it's a conventional warhead and it's not dual use. So we're not sure why we had this impression for a very long time that it was dual use. So in the event of India entering into a conflict next time, hypothetically speaking, I hope that that doesn't happen, at a higher rung, you think that it will be, from what you've said, it'll be that much more difficult to manipulate risk in terms of, calculating and actually get into a situation of uncertainty?
I think, first, I don't think it's necessarily clear that the next time India will be attracted to doing Sindoor plus, like it did Balakot plus this time.
So, like,
it's possible they try to go sooner but smaller. And in fact, I might even encourage India to do that as a way to regain some rungs on the ladder if it were to continue down this punitive pathway. Because I think the rungs available on the ladder above May 10th start getting, closer to the nuclear shadow. There's still plenty of rungs there, but we're getting a little higher. It's when you look down, you start getting a little wary. when you're up that high. So I think there is some danger next time around. I do think that to the extent that Pakistan was concerned by dual use as a reason to restrain the weapon systems, I might think that restraint will not be present in a future crisis. Dual use always has two potential meanings, right? One is dual use capable, that the warhead is of a sufficient size and that the country in question has a sufficiently small nuclear warhead to fit atop the device. And the other is dual use in practice, whether that the country does so. And the DRDO and the Indian press for many years referred to Brahmos as being capable, often the phrase they would use was to carry all sorts of warheads or many types of warheads, but without much explanation of what that phrase entailed. And in many occasions, the Indian media referred to it as dual use. And it's certainly of the size of a warhead that other nuclear weapon states could make a warhead that size. We don't know. We don't fully know that much about the warheads in the Indian arsenal and the success of the 1998 tests. So we're always having to infer. And similarly, we don't fully know how small Pakistan can make warheads, but it is very plausible that it could atop a cruise missile. The other danger with cruise missiles, though, the other literal cost of a cruise missile is not the dual use capability, the potential for being misread, but just the literal expense of the platform. These are platforms that routinely cost about $1 million a pop, and that's a lot when you might be needing to use dozens of them in the course of a campaign.
Yeah, in this case, Scalp EG and also the Brahmos. But Ilhan, tell me this. We have seen the attack on the air bases where Scalp EG and Brahmos were used. Brahmos top speed, according to the Indians, is about 3.5 Mach. Even if it's flying at 2.7 or so, and if you air launch it from, let's say, 200 kilometers east of the border, and we have an elongated geography, so we don't have that much depth. It has a distance of a range of about 400 kilometers, maybe a little more. They're actually working on what they call a Brahmos NG, new generation, which is going to be lighter with a range of about 750 kilometers. So now that we know that CMD is in any case very difficult to work, I mean, even for the Americans, because it doesn't have a ballistic trajectory. Its trajectory is not consistent. Against the ballistic missiles, the hit-to-kill vehicle actually relies on the consistency of the trajectory, which has now forced, obviously, countries to develop the maneuverable re-entry vehicles. But cruise missiles are notoriously difficult to intercept. So do you think that kind of, in the event, given India's stated policy that it will attack Pakistan if there is an attack in occupied Kashmir, you really think that Pakistan needs to, in case of any such attack, preempt it?
But I think this is a very old problem when it comes to states and going to war. And, in effect, if a state has made an assertion that we are going to do something, then the adversary should assume that they are going to do what say they are going to do, unless there is some very compelling indication that the public statement that they have made is just for show or not particularly serious. Given what has recently happened, it would be extremely naive of Pakistan to fall into the perhaps overthinking that, well, maybe the Indians don't really mean what they have said. Related to this, you mentioned an article by Ludwig a little bit earlier, and I just wanted to comment that, there are two great illusions that cause the outbreak of big wars. One is the illusion that a war can be won, and the second is the illusion that we can manage escalation. And I'm afraid that right now, at the domestic level, this is the kind of thinking which is prevailing in New Delhi. And at the international level, there are scholars who are effectively rationalizing the Indian choice of going for these escalatory responses in the mistaken belief that these responses can, in fact, be managed. So it is very important, I think, for scholars especially to try and disabuse those in power of the idea that they can A, win easily, and B, prevail in a limited conflict and somehow manage the whole thing through various tactical or clever means that they think they have at their disposal. And I mean, history is literally littered with tens of millions upon millions of people who died precisely because their leaders fell into these two traps. So we should try and get our leaders to think along slightly more historical and more rational lines.
Right. Chris, literally about 7 or 8 hours before the shooting began, I did a program with Siddharth and Dan Markey. And I asked Dan a question with reference to why, because India has relied, before, aggressing, has relied on diplomatic support from the United States and from other states, which did not come forth this time. So I asked Dan what the reason was. And he gave me two reasons. Well, kind of three reasons, but yeah, two of them were allied. One is that India keeps talking about strategic autonomy and multipolarity, and this is a position that it has taken with kind of with a degree of vehemence since the Russo-Ukraine war. And they've been basically tutoring the Europeans that, don't consider Europe as the center of the world. It's something that you have to deal with yourself. So that was one reason. The second reason was, which Dan gave, was that they did not provide even a smoking gun this time. And people weren't really impressed. And linked to that was the fact that there is obviously now, it's known around the world that the Indian intelligence has been mounting these covert assassination operations in Canada, and they attempted it in the United States. They have actually done it successfully, a number of such assassinations inside Pakistan. Do you think you would agree with these points? Do you think there is some other way of looking at why India could not get the kind of diplomatic support that it was relying on or it expected would come forth?
Sure. You keep on citing scholars who I know and respect and have learned a lot from, Dan and Arzan and Walter. So rather than sort of grade their answer, I'm not in that role here. I'm not in that professorial role. I'll just give you as a student my answer, which is that the U.S. has a vital national interest in preventing a nuclear war in South Asia. And when leaders are in positions of authority and the South Asian crisis comes in, 8 times out of 10, they realize that this interest is present and preeminent. Occasionally you get a John Bolton in the seat who is willing to roll the dice. But most of the time, the leaders look at the picture and they say, oh, this could get very bad. This could be deeply injurious to U.S. interest. And so we will work to resolve the crisis as speedily and with as little violence as possible. And I think the Trump team, faced with this crisis that it could not prevent in a war, in a world where there were lots of other crises that it was already kind of bogged down in, decided to push to exit this one as speedily as possible. And I think that interest, that shared interest that India, Pakistan, and the U.S. had was preeminent for DC, present for Pakistan, and least acutely felt by India, which also had a set of interests of trying to restore deterrence in its mind against the use of proxy militant violence by Pakistan on its soil. So that I think is what drove the response. I think the response was largely managed at a very high level by the Secretary of State, who's also the acting national security advisor on the U.S. side, and I think they played a helpful role. There may have been other parties, the Saudis, others may have played a helpful role, but I think in the absence of clear and regular lines of communication between New Delhi and Islamabad, it was helpful to have a conduit that could get Jaishankar and Dar, that could get General Asim Munir and Ajit Doval on the phone.
Yeah, but the Vice President Vance is on record as having said that this is their issue and they can slug it out. Frankly, words to that effect. It was only after things started getting hot, and of course the fact that you didn't give me the reasons for why India didn't get the kind of diplomatic support, but I'll let that be. But Ilhan, before I close the program, this whole issue of sort of a standard line in India, obviously, but also among the Western scholars and policymakers about Pakistan's proxy war, without any reference to the context, frankly, or the fact that while India, even this time, basically blamed Pakistan, it was demolishing the homes of local Kashmiris on the basis of its own, declared investigations into the attack. So I don't really get to square that whole idea with this, this kind of standard line terrorist infrastructure. I mean, you're hitting mosques, you're hitting residential compounds, you're killing civilians, including 6 children, but somehow it has to be a terrorist compound. How do we turn this narrative around? How can we begin to make the world understand that there is a context to what is happening in occupied Kashmir? That this is a live issue on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council, where India took this issue. The solution has been given there. And by all accounts, including Joseph Corbels, who was nominated by India, was India's choice, the father of Madeleine Albright, who also ended up blaming India for all the dithering and excuses and the rest of it. So how do we turn this narrative around in order for the world to understand what the real issue is?
I think that it's easy enough for the world to understand what the real issue is. The problem is nobody really cares. And that's because it doesn't really matter to them in the way that it would matter to Pakistan or to the Kashmiris. So in that sense, the Kashmir issue is at best seen as a source of trouble between India and Pakistan, which recently got very, very spooky for a lot of people. But fundamentally, there is nothing that any power is going to do in order to compel India to negotiate with Pakistan on this issue, or to recognize in the abstract or in the more concrete sense any rights that may or may not have been granted to the Kashmiris through various UN Security Council pronouncements. So I think that at a, let's say, rhetorical level, it's a good stick that Pakistan can use to beat India with at different international fora. But in actual fact, in actual history, politics between states is not a debating competition. You don't get extra points just because you happen to be making a more technically correct argument than the other side. It's a power play. And in that power play, it is in no one's interest to help Pakistan out on Kashmir vis-a-vis India. The only possible power that has an interest, though is very cautious, and I would say even strategically timid, are the Chinese. And you might see more assistance from that side, particularly as the Chinese become more concerned with the destabilization of the India-Pakistan relationship and the increasingly likely prospect that there will be now regular rounds such as those we just saw between India and Pakistan. And China obviously has a very important prestige investment because it's Chinese weapon systems that are going up against different Russian and European platforms. And so far, if you follow Chinese social media, as I started doing so over the last month, they seem awfully chuffed with what's happened. So
Yeah.
I think that this is something to bear in mind. But in actual fact, the only thing that the world can do is to urge India and Pakistan to settle somewhere along the status quo and let bygones be bygones and, turn the page or whatever, and try to live amicably going forward. So I don't think this is really a starter, if you will, in any serious conversation between India or Pakistan, or between Pakistan and any other power. I'm pretty sure all you get is an eye roll from the other side when you start talking about plebiscites and human rights and inalienable right to self-determination and UN Security Council resolution and so on and so forth, because we all understand that the international system is not a determinant of global power relations, it is a reflection of it. So if Pakistan wants to help the Kashmiris, you need more global power. If you have that global power, you will be able to help them. If you don't, you can, it's your party and you can cry if you want to, but no one's really going to help you out.
Right. And on that note, as a matter of fact, your mention of China has given me a prompt for perhaps another episode. But thank you so much, Dr. Christopher Clary, Dr. Ilhan Niaz, for your insights. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. It doesn't get me any lucre, but it certainly makes us happy. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.